Alright guys, welcome back to the Razor Crest series. In this part, we need to go over the V-Ray render settings and then rendering. So if you are using the V-Ray PLE or the free version of V-Ray, there is a different step for what you have to do than if you're using the professional or full educational version of V-Ray. We're going to be going over all of that and then finally rendering our first pass of this landing shot. All right, so for this, we're also going to be using After Effects to have a look at our basic composite, just to make sure that everything is lining up as we expected. So make sure you have the OpenColor.io plugin installed. If you have any questions on that, please refer to one of the previous videos where we set that up, or you can always post a comment. All right, let's get started. All right, so now the fun task of setting up our render settings. Now, this is probably a part of the video that you'll need to reference later on if you do another class or something. This is very important and it's very, very powerful what you can do with this window right here. And that, first of all, is where the image is going to be saved, the type of file it's going to be saved, the animations, the cameras, all of that stuff. We're going to set that. Okay, so I'm going to set my render layer to the ship layer. So without creating overrides, everything that we change here applies to all of our layers, which is fine. So we're going to start at the top on common and work our way down. There's quite a lot of settings to do. First thing here is the file name prefix. And this is probably not something that you've changed before, but this is very, very powerful. And I'm going to show you a useful way of setting this up. So for this, I want to navigate to the Razor Crest and go to the images folder. This is the images that we created before of those test renders, and we had those EXRs here. But really, we want everything to be in a subfolder for every time that we render a new camera or a new version. So what you could do, you could create a folder here and have Maya save it to a specific folder. But what we're going to do instead is have Maya automatically tell V-Ray to create the folders for us. So we're going to delete all of this. And the way that we're going to do this automatically is by right-clicking, and then we have these tokens. There are more tokens that you can choose from than what are listed here, but those are very nuanced and specific. But these are pretty much everything that we need for this class. There's a whole bunch of ways you can set this up. So you could say the file name is automatically going to be whatever your actual file name is of your scene, which is very useful. You can do it based on the layer. You can do it based on the camera, the version number, date, time as well. So what we're going to do on this is say, I want to have every version that we render out in a separate folder, because you usually don't ever want to render out over the same version, because that's bad practice. And let's say you rendered it out and it was almost good, and then you decided, hey, let me do a version 2 or a version like 19 or something. And then the client goes, hey, we approved version 18. And you're like, oh, well, I just rendered over all of it. Now I need to render out version 18 again. So that's why you keep your versions until you're done with the project. So we're going to right click on this, and then we're going to start off with version. But we don't actually have a version label, and we do need that. So for the version label, that should be whatever your scene version is. So we're using version 1. We can say version 1. Now you could decide just to do this based on the scene if you wanted to. So if you wanted to take your entire file name, you could do that, but that's a little bit long. So instead, we'll just do version label. So it's going to create a folder for us called version if we add a slash. We'll do a slash. If we click off to the side here, you can see that this says ship version 1, and then it'll just be a blank PNG. It'll just be the frame number. So we can do version, and then inside that version folder, we'll create another folder for our layer. We're going to have a folder for the ship, folder for the environment, folder for the dust, and a folder for the sky. And I just realized that sky is a capital K, not what I wanted. So then we do another slash, and make sure that these are forward slashes, not backslashes. Anytime you do a slash, whatever's in front of it creates a folder called that. So we have version 1 as a folder, the ship is a folder because we're on the ship layer. And then we need to add in the layer again, underscore, the version label. So let me explain this again. So we have our file name is going to create a folder called version 1, a folder within version 1 called ship, and in the ship folder, every frame is going to be called ship version 1, followed by the frame number and then the extension. So it's set to PNGs right now, but we'll change that. If you are curious about playing around with this and you don't want to use the same setup, I highly recommend you do something just so you can differentiate it. So sometimes you might want to do it based on the date instead of a version number, or sometimes you want to do it based on the scene. And sometimes if you're rendering multiple cameras from the same scene, you'll want to use the camera as well. But use these tokens and it automatically figures out what the name is based on the layer that you're on and what your file is called and what camera you're using. Very useful. So if you have any questions on this, please reach out. This is very important to use for this class and for the future. All right, so next, the image format. So for this, we're going to be using EXRs, and there's 3 options. If you choose this first one, extractor will not work, and every single AOV will be rendered as a separate file. That's not going to be very fun to composite. So we're going to use multi-channel. And as I said earlier, After Effects cannot handle deep EXR sequences, and deep sequences are going to be extremely large, like to the point where your computer probably cannot handle it. This is not meant for trivial compositing. This is for very in-depth compositing, stuff that we can't even do in After Effects. So we're going to use multi-channel EXR. There's a bunch of settings here that do specific things, but if you're curious, the only one that's pretty useful is this one, resumable rendering, which means that a new file will be saved for every frame that renders successfully. And that means that if you render halfway and you want to re-render it, all you have to do is click render and V-Ray will figure out what is already rendered up to a point. So that's useful, but it's going to give us way more files than we need, so we're not going to do that. So let's go to image format options now. And V-Ray groups all the image formats in one giant tab, but we are only interested in the OpenEXR option here. There are different compression types that we can choose. Scanline is going to be probably the best. It's lossless, but the files are fairly small. If you say no compression, your files will be absolutely enormous. So we don't want to do that. There's a whole bunch of them here. This one is a lossy compression, DWAB, or DWAA or DWAB. I use this at work because it keeps our files really small and we don't actually need that much stuff to composite at work. But for this class, we're going to do Scanline Zip. If you want to experiment with other ones or you're really short on hard drive space or you don't like to transfer stuff, these ones are almost indistinguishable on their lossiness. They're like really good, okay? But I'm going to do Scanline. Bits per channel, we work in 32 bits per channel. Maya and V-Ray render at 32-bit, but we don't actually need all that information. We're just going to keep this at 16. Render region is going to be the entire image, okay? You should usually do this unless you are trying to render out, for example, just a specific section. Like you can create these little windows and you could only render that. So let's say, for example, you wanted to change one building that is only occupying this side of the frame the entire time or for a portion of frames. You can do a render region and it was only going to render out that part of the image. But it's very easy to accidentally forget that you leave this on. This is why the whole image is better to set this to. So underneath here, we also have an option for what is called a multi-part EXR. Multi-part EXRs is an extension of EXR, basically. It's a way of reading an EXR file, kind of like a folder, like a zip file, for example, and only pulling out what it needs. This is a newer format of EXR, and it's a little bit faster to use in most cases because it's just more efficient in After Effects and Nuke and Fusion and stuff like that. If you don't do this, you're probably not going to notice any difference for this class, but it is a bit more efficient to have these save as multi-part. Extra attributes, well, we don't really have any to add, but you can do all sorts of interesting things. If you had color adjustments saved here that you wanted to bake into the EXR, you could save that here, but we're not going to do that. So really, you don't need to even go to this option box at all, but if you wanted to see what these are and see what I set mine to, this is what I do. I sometimes do this, but for this class, Scanline is fine. Okay, so we can go back out of that, close the IPR again, and now we can go down to animation. So this is going to be pretty important. If you don't set animation, it's only going to render one frame. So we want to do standard probably, but standard is going to render from frame 1 to frame 10 by default. We're going to be rendering frame 1 to frame 200. I don't really want any more frames than this, and I'm sure you don't want to have to render more than 200 frames. This is pretty standard Maya stuff. There's not a lot of change here. This option over here, is if you want to render like a full production frame, but you don't want it to render the entire sequence, you check this just so you can render like one frame at a time. If you only use IPR, it doesn't matter, but if you click on this icon up here, the main clapperboard, V-Ray by default will just start rendering the entire sequence. So that's useful to leave on if you're not ready to render. And also if you're using the free version of V-Ray, the PLE version, the Personal Learning Edition, you have to leave this unchecked to actually render everything out because you don't have what is called batch mode, which I'll be showing you in a minute in case you are on campus. There's two different versions of how you render stuff. So you probably want to leave that unchecked unless you're just still not ready to render. Okay, so next is the renderable camera. This is important. You want to make sure this is set to camera 1. If you have multiple cameras, you can add more, but we're only going to be using one camera here. For the resolution, we've already set this. It's 1920 by 817, 2.35:1 aspect ratio. That's good. If you wanted to do 16 by 9, it would be 1920 by 1080. You have to render it at least this though. Well, you need to be turning your comps in at least 1920 by 1080 in the comp. So there'll be some letterboxing on our comp, but that's fine. All right. Next, we'll go up to V-Ray. First of all, there are two options for the renderer. We're using the V-Ray one here. If you are on a laptop or you're on a older computer, you probably need this on V-Ray. So if you have an RTX card or let's say a 1080 or above, you might want to consider turning on the V-Ray GPU mode. For something as simple as this, it's probably fine to use. Problems with GPU rendering are usually due to the fact that you run out of memory quite quickly on a GPU. So if you have a more modern video card, let's say at least 8 gigs of RAM, you might be able to start using GPU rendering. If you have, let's say 1080, you probably can just about get by with that. If you have like a 2080 or 2080 Ti or like a 3000 series, you might want to consider rendering with the GPU. If you're on campus, you also might want to consider rendering with the GPU. V-Ray is getting very, very close to having its GPU mode as complete as the regular V-Ray mode. This one uses your processor, your CPU. This one relies more heavily on your GPU. There are differences between these. For this specific scene though, you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference, but sometimes the lighting changes. So the way that it does its algorithms is very slightly different. So you might notice, especially with dust, you might actually notice a significant change. I'm going to set mine to GPU, but if you do not have a graphics card that's capable of running it, you probably will have to change it back to V-Ray. So if you're on campus, it's up to you. I'm going to leave mine on GPU, but as I said, that's up to you. If you have an RTX card, there is the option for RTX ray tracing, basically. It's an acceleration. You can leave this on, you can leave it off. I honestly haven't noticed much difference if you have GPU mode on. Out of core means if your GPU runs out of memory, it doesn't just crash the whole scene and stop rendering. It's supposed to be able to put some of that memory that was on your GPU and store it on your system RAM, and then when it needs it again, it will grab it. It's a very, very slow and inefficient process, but it prevents your render from failing, so usually you want to have that on if you're in GPU mode. If you're not, you can't do this at all. So there's no option. The rest of the settings here are going to be the same, whether you're on GPU or CPU mode, it doesn't matter. The sampler type, if you are on regular V-Ray mode, you absolutely should 100% be on progressive, okay? Progressive is going to allow you to change your maximum render time like we discussed before. And what I recommend for something like this is that you do something really, really quick, like 0.5. So 30 seconds a frame, that's going to be pretty good. But 30 seconds a frame is probably going to turn into a 2-hour render because we have 200 frames. So if we said 30 seconds a frame and we have 200 frames, that's going to be, let's say, 100 minutes to render each one of these passes, right? So these are going to take a while to render out. Sky will be super quick. The environment will probably be pretty quick, and so the ship will probably be pretty quick too. The dust is going to be what's going to take the longest, probably. But I would recommend when you're just doing a first pass, like version 1, you leave this at 0.5, or you could say 0.25. So this is in minutes, so 25% of a minute is 15 seconds. Keep it low, especially if you are on a lower end computer. It's going to be very grainy, but we have that denoiser. We have this denoiser right here, which we'll have to come back to in a minute because I forgot to do something with that. But this is going to speed up your render time considerably, okay? It's going to try to aim for 15 seconds a frame or 30 seconds a frame or 1 minute a frame. It's going to attempt to do that. Bucket rendering is going to take a lot longer. If you do want to use Bucket though, let's say you want to render on 2 computers at the same time and they're completely different computers. Like one is a laptop, which is nowhere near as good, and the other one is a super high-end computer that's blazing fast. Well, Progressive is going to give you different qualities on both of those usually. So Bucket makes sure that they're the same quality, but if you want to increase your speed, you would increase the threshold. You would say something like 0.05 or 0.075 or something like that. The higher this number, the grainier your image is. So those are the differences. I would recommend leaving this on Progressive for V-Ray mode and just doing 0.25 and just see what your computer can do. I'm going to be setting this to GPU mode on mine. And if you're on a GPU, I highly recommend using Bucket mode. Bucket tends to be more efficient for the GPU and it gives you a pretty good result. Now for this though, I would say on your threshold, you could do something like 0.1 on your threshold for a quick version. You will need to lower this for a final version, otherwise it will be pretty grainy or very blurry with the denoiser. All right, after that, color mapping. We actually don't want to have color mapping. Color mapping is the same thing as tone mapping, but we already have tone mapping with ACES. So we don't want to have any of that at all. If you don't want any of it at all, change it to linear multiply. That basically doesn't allow any tone mapping at all. But if you want to be doubly sure, you say mode, don't affect colors, only adaptation. But we're not actually changing anything there. This is important to change. All right, so that's good. For the image sampler here, if you want this to look a little bit softer, you can do Gaussian. This produces a slightly softer image. It's not as sharp, but it's a slightly more filmic look, in my opinion. So this is what I usually use, is Gaussian. All right, GI. GI should be on by default. That's probably fine. For the preset here, if you are trying to use what is called a light cache, it's going to calculate your bounce light, but not for every frame. It's going to do it for either one frame if it's on a still and just use that same cache for the entire animation. But that can lead to poor results, especially if there's a lot of motion going on. You can set it to animation, but this is going to increase your render time quite a lot. For this, we're going to leave it on still. But if you're trying to do a final production render, we're going to do brute force. So it doesn't use a cache. But for now, this is good to go on this. Settings, we don't really need to change anything here at all. I don't remember ever really needing to do anything here. Overrides, we want to make sure viewport subdivision is enabled. This means that if you have something that is smooth shaded inside the viewport in Maya, V-Ray actually will render the smooth shaded. It won't render the unsubdivided version. That's pretty important. Go to the camera here. We do want to have motion blur, so we're going to enable motion blur. And everything else will be good to go. If you wanted to do any volumetrics like aerial perspective, you can do that down here, but we didn't really talk about that. Okay, so one last thing that I forgot to show you with the denoiser. Once you have applied the denoiser, by default, it's going to do it on the beauty, but we really don't want it on the beauty. We don't care. We just need to go to each one of these passes and make sure the denoise section clicked on. So just check that on. So V-Ray will denoise all of these, and both the Cryptomatte has no denoiser and neither does denoise, obviously. And we want to make sure that denoise is set on this one. There's also no denoising on the depth either. Okay, a lot of settings there, but that is the quick rundown. All right, so before we start rendering this, I need to draw your attention back to the render setup window. And this is going to be really important if you are batch rendering. So if you're on campus or you have a full version of V-Ray, whether it's the student version or a commercial version in the future, these icons are very important. We already know what the eye does, and that's simply to select the current render layer. But the other icon indicates whether the layer is set to rendered or not to render. So if it's blue, that means it is set to render. But for the master layer or the scene layer over here, we actually want to uncheck that. So this layer is everything that is in the scene. This is what we use to check the lighting and see all the components together. So like the ship, the cliff, the sky, the dust, all of that in one layer. We don't want that to render though, because it's going to be kind of useless for us. We are separating these out so we can control them better. But ultimately, all these layers is going to recreate this one over here. So much like how we use AOVs to recreate the beauty, we're basically taking apart the master layer and we're recreating that with these. So we don't want that one to render. It's just going to take a long time to render and we'll never need it. So make sure you uncheck that, otherwise you'll have a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted space. The same thing will apply later on if you, for example, need to re-render only one of these. So let's say the environment and the sky is really good, but maybe you wanted to reanimate the ship. So you might need a different ship layer and you might need to re-render the dust again. That means that you don't need to render the environment again and you don't need to render the sky again. So you would only need to do the ship and the dust. Or let's say you just wanted to change how the rocks look. You wanted to change their height or change the geometry completely. Then you could simply do that. And now it's only going to render out your environment. But again, this only applies if you are on campus. If you are not on campus or you don't have a full version of V-Ray, which is, I would suspect the majority of you are just using the PLE, what you have to do instead is go one by one and simply render out each one of these. But I want to show you batch rendering first and then we'll come back. So let's go up to our render settings again, common. So temporarily, I just want to set my end frame to 1, just so it renders out just one frame and then it will stop. And for batching, there are 2 options to access batching. First of all, make sure your tab is set to rendering, then go to render, batch render, and this will open up the script editor and it will show you a progress right here. But there's another option which is very useful, and it involves closing down Maya completely. Because if Maya is open, especially if you have either a lower end computer or a very heavy scene that's taking a lot of system resources just to run, you can free up the system. You can free up your computer by simply closing down Maya, especially if you're on a lower end computer or have a very intensive scene open. Closing down Maya just frees up some of your system resources, so you don't need to see what's in the viewport, for example. It can free up some video memory especially. So you can simply close down Maya completely. I'm going to save this. And then you can go to your scenes folder, right click over the scene name, and then click render. And as long as all your render settings are set properly, when you click render, it'll open up a command line, and then it's going to basically just initialize the scene. And that could take, depending on your system, a few seconds, a few minutes, just depends on the complexity of your scene and your hardware. But once this starts going, you navigate to the images folder. This is where it's going to start creating images like we set in the file name prefix options. So over here is loading in bitmaps. It's going to give you a lot of different logs basically of what's going on. But you can see that the version 1 folder has been created. And inside the version 1 folder, whichever layer you created first is going to render first. In this case, this is the ship layer. If we open up the ship layer, this is where your first EXR is going to be rendered out. And you can see a progress over here. It does it in 10% increments. Once that is done, it then has to save it. So you can see the EXR has been added here. If I double click this, anytime that you look at an EXR file, it's not going to have the gamma correction on it. So it's going to appear to be very dark. We can back out of this one, and then you can see the environment folder has been added and it's rendering the environment. And then as soon as that is finished denoising, we'll save out the environment. And now you can see the environment right here, which is pretty cool. Next, it will do the dust. Now the dust is probably going to be blank because the camera is so high up right now. So this is going to be it's going to be empty on that one. And then it will do the sky right here. And then of course the sky is going to be, it's going to appear to be empty because XNView by default ignores the alpha channel. So that's that. When the rendering is done, it will close your command window. That doesn't necessarily mean it was successful. It just means it's no longer rendering. So that's how you can batch render. Now, of course, when you batch render, you're going to want to batch render the entire animation, but I just wanted to show you one frame of that. Now I'm going to open up Maya again, and then show you what to do if you're using the PLE version at home. I'm going to go back to my images folder. I'm going to delete this just so I can show you this. And this time we're going to go right to the very end, because after this, I also want to show you how to composite this really quickly in After Effects, just to make sure that you've done everything correctly, so you don't waste an entire afternoon or entire day rendering this, depending on how long it takes. So I'm going to go to frame 200, and if you are on the PLE version, you need to go to render settings. And in this case, I want to set my start frame to 200, and my end frame would also be 200. Of course, we're not rendering a sequence. I just want to show you that last frame in After Effects. So we need to set this up like this. When you're doing your full sequence, it will be 1 to 200, but just for right now, we're doing that. All right, so the way this works, you have to make sure you select the correct viewport, because the renderable camera, this is only for batch rendering. It doesn't apply for sequence rendering inside of Maya, as far as V-Ray is concerned. So you need to select whichever one you want to start with. It doesn't matter the order, but I can just start at the top with the ship and close down that, and then I can click on the frame buffer. And make sure you don't click the IPR clapperboard. It's the clapperboard with no text inside. And right here, we start with the ship. And if we go back to our images folder, you can see a version 1 folder has been created again. Inside that, a ship folder has been created. The same thing with batch rendering, but it's only going to do one, and then you have to set up the next one. So this one is nearly done. As soon as that finishes there, it's then going to do a denoising pass, which is usually pretty quick, and then it has to save it. Once it's saved, your ship will be there. But then notice that it's completely done. The frame buffer will stay open, but it's no longer rendering anymore. And if you see this as a grayed out stop, that means it's no longer rendering. So next, you got to go to the next render layer and manually set that off yourself. Not something that you would be able to do at a company, usually. Like, you would want that to be completely automated, so you could be done for the day and then come back the next day and your frames are ready. You don't want to have to constantly be monitoring the render for when it's done to be able to set up the next one. So this is something that they have deliberately prevented you from doing with the free version, which is understandable, but it is still annoying. All right, so when that is done, you can see that we have a folder now for the environment. There's our one frame of the environment, frame 200. Next, we got to do the dust. The dust is probably going to be the longest to render, I would think. If not, maybe the ship would be. The sky should be pretty quick. But these are rendering fairly quickly. These can be pretty grainy, by the way, for this first pass. So if you realize that the settings that I've shown you are just still taking too long, feel free to increase the threshold, reduce your time limit. It's okay for this first pass. All right, so that's that. And then we'll do the next one here, which is the sky. That hopefully will be pretty quick. And so if you don't have any view selected, it'll be like, which camera did you want? You gotta click the right one. If we back out here, you can see that the dust was created right there, and the sky folder is being created. And as soon as that's done, there's your sky. Okay, so let's just check to make sure all of these are working as we expect them to work inside of After Effects. So let's open up After Effects. This is also going to be pretty quick because this is review. We'll just leave that as comp 1 for right now. And we can leave this letterbox for right now too. That's perfectly fine. We first need to create an adjustment layer for our ACES color correction. So let's open Color IO, drag that over. Configuration, if you're at home, should find the last configuration file. If you cannot remember its display correction, you just grab this path, copy and paste that. Copy and paste that in here. That's what we need. Display, input space, scene linear, ACES CG. And then we're good on that. Next, we need a color profile converter. sRGB, sRGB, linearize. All right, cool. Right, so on the sky, we need to right click over the sky, interpret footage main, ignore the alpha, because we do want to see that, like that. Next, we'll need our environment. There's our environment. Then we'll have the ship. And then we'll have the dust. So far so good. If you notice, the dust is just the dust cut around the ship. So all of that is transparent. And you might notice one problem here, and this is because the ship is technically on top of the environment, but really it would be behind this piece of geometry right here. So we do need to fix that. Now, this can be done in a variety of ways, but I'm going to show you a cheap solution that probably works for the majority of you, because the landing gear is completely obscured behind all of this geometry, all of these rocks. If your camera is higher looking down, what you need to do is go back into Maya and include the ship matte on your environment. But in this case, I wanted to show you a different way of doing that. So this is going to depend on how you've set this up. If you have set this up like mine and the camera's pretty low, you can do the following. You can grab what is called a Cryptomatte. You would go down to your environment, you would duplicate your environment, click enter, and then you would say environment ground matte or just ground matte. And then you can grab the Cryptomatte on that ground matte. Now, when Cryptomatte is applied, this is going to give different colors for all of your objects. And the colors that it chooses in After Effects are going to be different based on what the V-Ray frame buffer showed you. This is because any implementation of Cryptomatte, like either in After Effects or in V-Ray, it's all the same type of algorithm to do it, but it just randomizes the colors of your geometry. There's no like set pattern of what colors it chooses, so this is why it might look different. But then you just simply click the geometry you want to turn into a matte, go to output, change that to matte only, and then we can use this as a Luma matte. So then on the ship, we would drag our environment ground above the ship, turn off these solos. Then on the ship right here, we would say track matte would be Luma inverted. That ship can go anywhere except where that ground is. And now you can see it is hiding behind those rocks. Like that. So that's basically what we would do there. On the off chance that you can see the landing gear clearly on yours, you probably didn't even need to do that at all. But for some reason that doesn't work. You can re-render your environment with the ship matted out in the same way that we did the dust. So review how to do it on the dust and to do the same thing on your environment layer. And as always, if for whatever reason you can't figure it out, just ask me and I'll be more than happy to show you again. Okay, right, so that is that. Now we need to make sure that our passes are working, or AOVs are working. So we're going to go to the effects, go to our effects and presets, extractor, drag this on the ship, and we're going to start off with GI. We solo this. It's going to appear very dark, but if you increase your exposure here, you can see that there is something there. There is information there. I'm going to click enter and then type in ship GI. And then we will duplicate that, but I don't want to show you the full composite right now. So we're actually going to turn off this track matte temporarily, and it will be sticking on top of the ground, but that's okay for right now. Next, we're going to make a copy of that. This is going to be our lighting. We go down to lighting. This will be additive. We'll just add that on top. Again, this is going to look pretty dark, and that's because the ship is metal. Next, we're going to do reflection. This is called reflect. Specular. Fraction. This time we also have one for AO. We do AO. If this doesn't say AO, look for extra text because you may have forgotten to change that. So do AO. And we also have one for depth. And AO is going to be multiplied. And depth is not actually used as a blending mode at all. It's just normal. Okay, so we can actually turn both of these off. And then this should match whatever your beauty is exactly. If you want to double check that, to take another copy of your ship over here, place that on top. And if you turn that on and off, the only difference you should see is the beauty will be a little bit more grainy, or quite a lot more grainy if you turn on your denoiser, because all those passes have the denoise filter applied. But by default, RGB does not have that. That's why it's going to be a bit grainier. But other than that, it looks the same. It looks correct. Okay, we can actually just delete that. If we add our AO to the ship, we're just darkening the edges down. So if we zoom in, we're darkening that down. And then on the depth, this will be used with the whole scene when we are ready to do the composite. There's one thing that this is lacking. If we go back into Maya here, I forgot to set up our lens effects. So I'm going to do that really fast. Back to the IPR. And then to enable lens effects, you got to go down to enable bloom and glare right here. And if you get some crazy image right here, it's because the denoiser is kind of interfering with it. So just turn off your denoiser for right now. And then you want to click on enable bloom and glare. And what happens is after that is done, it should apply some glare. And you can see that's pretty subtle. You probably want to increase that though. So we could do an intensity of maybe 2. You can increase the size as well. And there's those 2 options, if you recall. There's bloom. If you increase that all the way up, that's just going to be a glow. If you pull that all the way down to 0, it's going to give you more of a sharp kind of star shape. So if I make this ridiculously big, you should be able to see that a little bit more clearly. Like that. That's kind of ridiculous, like a star. If it's at 1, if you do that at like 1, it's more just going to be like a glowy highlight. I like the glint at 0. So that's up to you though. You can choose what you want. For the intensity, we can always change that in post. The size though, we can't really change in post. So I would do something like maybe 50 or 40. You could even leave it on the default and it probably looks fine. Now, these are things that we could go back and we could change later for the next pass, but just to get something into After Effects, I wanted to show you that. So that's how you enable it. This will automatically create a pass for you. Stop the IPR there. And then we just need to render out the ship again. I'll just click on the render icon and just let that render out the ship again. All right, so when that is done, you don't need to save it because it's already being saved. So you can go back into After Effects. The way that you refresh this, you would simply right-click over this layer and then say reload. Nothing's going to appear to change, but now if you duplicate the topmost layer there, the ship depth, type in ship glare instead, then in layers, you should now have a glare AOV. Click on that. And then you have glare, that will be added. And now you have glare. I'm going to place this above my speculator right there, but it doesn't really matter. You can place it wherever. And once you've done all that, you would do the same thing for your environment. Your environment also has those same passes. Just check to make sure they're all there. You should have everything like GI, your reflections. You can just flick through these if you're pretty confident they're all set up. If they work fine for the Razor Crest, they should be the same here. The really important one for us though is going to be depth. Depth needs to be working properly. So we're going to be combining this with the ship depth, and we'll be creating some depth of field with that. Also, just make sure that Cryptomatte works. Now, there is a Cryptomatte pass here, but you can't do anything with these really. Not here. So if I click on this, this is going to be black, because these aren't really, the extractor is looking for like color information, but they technically have color, but they're not going to be interpreted properly because their values are just numbers. They're not really color values. What Cryptomatte does, that is how you view the Cryptomatte pass, and this will assign a color for every ID basically. So that's what we're going to be using for that. Okay, so just make sure the environment works as well. I don't really want to show that in this video because it's already gone on for too long. Okay, once you have got all of that working and you're sure everything is ready to go, then you can go back to Maya and set up your full sequence. So let's go up to the render settings, start frame, frame 1. And if you are using the PLE, just click this button one at a time, go through all of these. If you're on campus, just batch render it and that will be good. One other thing that I wanted to point out here. If you are struggling with this and your renders are taking forever, there's a few things that you can do to kind of speed this up. For now, you could delete the denoiser because that does take extra time. And you could also remove AO. AO is probably the least important part of this entire shot. It is nice to have, but AO does take longer to render because it is not part of the beauty. It does have to calculate that, and it does have to render it, and it can be quite noisy. So these two things would increase your time a little bit. I would still like these for the final. You will need to have denoising for the final submission unless you have a supercomputer and you don't need denoising at all. So you probably need that. So if you're on bucket mode, you could increase your threshold. This is a really, really high threshold. You have to have denoising with that. Otherwise, this is going to be way too grainy. If you're on progressive, just lower your max render time. You can also try to increase your noise threshold too. And then the next video will be comping our first pass of the entire sequence. All right, guys, thanks for watching. If you have any questions on V-Ray render settings or rendering in general, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video.